Welcome back, everybody. We are now going to look at part two of our interview with the wonderful Trent Hone, because if you've watched the previous interview, you'll know we talked through US Navy tactics and development through from the Spanish-American War through to the almost the outbreak of World War II. But of course, World War II was just a little bit important for US Navy tactics and development. So we thought we won't leave you hanging. We'll follow up on that. So, of course, we're going to be talking about that today. So for those viewers who either haven't yet seen the first interview or perhaps have forgotten, would you mind letting everyone know who you are?
Yeah, sure. So Trent Hone, like you mentioned, written a book recently called Learning War, and it is about the evolution of the U.S. Navy's tactical doctrine from the Spanish-American War up through the end of World War II, primarily with a focus on surface warfare tactics and doctrine. And it looks at the United States Navy as a complex adaptive system. And I make the argument that the Navy was an effective learning organization over that time. And so it was able to evolve new approaches to surface warfare tactics, to tactics more generally, but especially surface warfare tactics, and that learning system was very important on the run-up to World War II, and then particularly decisive in the early years of that war, coming up with new approaches to fighting the Japanese in the Pacific that were instrumental to victory in that conflict.
Okay, so let's get into a bit more of those details then. So starting off at the start of World War II, how bad was the division between the so-called battleship admirals and the carrier admirals? There's a lot made of it, but was it kind of an even split? Was it hopelessly one side or the other? What was going on?
Well, it is a lot less tense, I think, than certain histories have suggested to us. There were a number that came out not too long after the war, and many of these present the position of some of the so-called carrier admirals, the aviators, who felt like they had been held back in the interwar period and then in World War II itself. One of those admirals, for example, was John Towers, who was head of the Bureau of Aviation and also a commander during the war. And he felt that he should have had the opportunity to do more. It's very clear from his writing and his biography. But if you look at the beginning of the war, the split is not nearly as acrimonious as we might have been led to believe, right? And there are some very good examples of why and how that was the case. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher is a very good one. So he's a surface warfare officer. He's not a carrier admiral, but he commands 3 of the 4 large carrier battles that are fought in 1942. Right? So he is the commander at Coral Sea, where the United States Navy and its allies win a strategic victory. He is the overall carrier task force commander at Midway, very famous and decisive victory there. And he also commands the U.S. Navy's carrier forces at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. And that stops the Japanese effort to retake the island of Guadalcanal. So we've got 3 of the 4 major carrier battles in 1942 in the hands of what was called a black shoe, a surface warfare officer. And brown shoes were the naval aviators. And John Lindstrom has written a very good book that studies Admiral Fletcher and his command through those years. And it's called Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, a reference to that fact. Another really good example is Raymond Spruance. So he's also a surface warfare officer. He is usually more closely associated with the victory at Midway than Fletcher is. He gets a bit better press and is well known for that. But how he comes to be in command of Task Force 16, which has Enterprise and Hornet at Midway, is important, right? So that is Admiral Halsey's task force. And after his leadership of the Doolittle raid and a sojourn into the South Pacific, he comes down with an attack of dermatitis. He can't command. Nimitz wants him to command at Midway, but he's just not able to. And so Nimitz now has a choice. Who am I going to install in this task force? Who's going to command the carriers? And Halsey, surprisingly enough, recommends Spruance. Spruance has been his cruiser screen commander. So Spruance is not an aviator, but Halsey is confident that he's going to be able to lead the task force. Nimitz accepts that idea, which is why Fletcher ends up commanding, because he's superior to Spruance. But Spruance is in command of the task force with the 2 carriers that that mount some of the decisive strikes. So there's another good example, right? Early in the war, we've got these surface warfare officers who are doing a good job at commanding the U.S. Navy's carrier forces. Now, later on, as the carrier forces grow in power and strength, a little bit more of this friction comes to the fore. You get people like Towers and King advocating for more air-mindedness within the Pacific Fleet, right? So Spruance gets criticized later on because he's the commander of the Fifth Fleet in 1944, the Battle of Philippine Sea around the Marianas. And Towers and other aviators thinks that his positioning of the carrier forces is inappropriate and it allows the Japanese to shuttle bomb Task Force 58. But Spruance does a good job at ensuring that the invasion forces aren't damaged. And, the Marianas is called the turkey shoot for a reason, because the U.S. naval aviators have gotten so good at intercepting incoming Japanese strikes. But there's a solution that gets introduced, which I think, organizationally is quite creative. For each of the major commands in the Pacific, there's going to be either an aviator responsible for it, or his chief subordinate, his chief of staff, is going to be an aviator. And so they're pairing more traditional surface warfare officers with aviators. So, for example, Spruance gets an aviator as his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Arthur Davis, and then his carrier commander, Mark Mitcher, gets Arleigh Burke, a very experienced surface warfare officer, as his chief of staff, and Nimitz sets an example and makes Towers his chief of staff. So there's this nice integration of carrier aviators and the battleship admirals, for example, and it works out pretty well.
Yeah. So during most of the interwar period, when you've got the so-called rainbow plans, the US Navy has kind of its plan for the Pacific is sail across the Pacific, confront the Japanese Navy in the Western Pacific. But in the immediate run-up to their involvement in World War II, and obviously the actual execution of World War II, that doesn't happen. So what prompts that change in tactics? Why does the US Navy decide at the end of the 1930s, actually, we're not going to go and try and fight a line of battle engagement off of the Philippines?
This is a shift that occurs through the interwar wargaming. You're absolutely right. So yeah, before the rainbow plans, there's the orange plan, right? In the U.S. military, each of the potential opponents is given a color. Orange is the color of the Japanese. And so there are orange plans that the U.S. Navy works on. And throughout much of the interwar period, the orange plan is a thruster plan. That's the term that Edward Miller uses in his book, War Plan Orange. There's thrusters and there's cautionaries. Thrusters want to steam right across the Pacific very quickly, as you said, seek a battle line engagement, destroy the Japanese fleet, and then impose a blockade. And this might have worked. At least there's a belief that it's going to work, in part because of the naval limitations treaties, right? The introduced at the Washington Treaty of 1922. They impose a ratio of 5-3 between the U.S. battle line and the Japanese battle line. And that gives the U.S. battle line superiority, and enough superiority that they think they'll be able to do that, to steam across the Pacific and then fight a major surface action and win it. Because they assume that for every 1,000 miles or so that the fleet steams, it's going to lose about 10% of its strength. So 5-3 should, by their math, give them enough superiority to win a battle line action in the Western Pacific after steaming there. It's interesting, the Japanese are doing similar calculations, and this is one of the reasons why they insist on a 10-7 ratio, not a 5-3 ratio, because they think with 10-7, they've got a fighting chance of winning that engagement. Eventually, they get it with cruisers, but they never get that ratio with battleships. Now, the problem is, as technology changes, airplanes get better, longer range, greater striking power, and some of these light forces get more capable, right? Because of the treaty regime, the navies of the world are investing in powerful cruisers. They can help shepherd or lead destroyer attacks at night. And in a war game that the Naval War College conducts in 1934, they do this. They do the War Plan Orange. They do the campaign in the Pacific. It works. The Navy steams across the Pacific, it defeats the Japanese battle line action. It reaches the Philippines. However, the fleet has been so damaged that it can't easily repair itself and exert dominance in the Western Pacific now. There aren't the repair facilities in the Philippines necessary to bring it back up to strength. But in Japan, they have the necessary repair facilities. So enough of the Japanese battle line has been damaged that the U.S. Navy wins the victory in the battle line action. But now it's going to lose dominance of the Western Pacific because the Japanese battleships can be repaired, the U.S. battleships can't. And so 1934 marks this important shift where they begin to realize, well, this thruster approach, moving quickly across the Pacific, it's not going to work. We're going to lose. So we have to change it. And we have to change it in recognition of air power. And the Miller's term he uses, now the strategy becomes more cautionary, it becomes more methodical, right? We will advance in a slower way across the Pacific. We will seize bases as we go. We will build up the necessary strength. And then eventually, the Japanese will be forced to fight. They will lose, but we'll have repair facilities to take care of any damage. And then we will be able to impose a blockade. And that blockade idea goes back, I think, to the early 20s at least. That's how we're going to try to bring Japan to the negotiating table and achieve not just a military but also a political victory. So there's two things that I think are really important here. One is the recognition that the dynamics of the war are changing, right? Because air power is increasing in size and strength, and ships are changing and their capabilities are increasing. And then second, the U.S. Navy is able to make sense of that, able to tease out, circumstances are changing, we need to adjust, we're going to revise our plans. And that's part of the learning system that I tried to allude to and describe in my book, Learning War.
So obviously the rest of World War II, if you like, it breaks out in 1939. So by the end of 1941, whereas perhaps in their tactical considerations, the US might have thought, well, there'll be a certain number of British ships, French ships, Dutch ships, etc. in the Western Pacific, and whether or not they're directly involved, there's still going to be a concern for the Japanese at least. Whereas by the end of 1941, there are, should we say, substantially fewer British, French, and Dutch ships in the Western Pacific than there were in, say, 1938. Did that affect US tactics at all? Did they make changes in consideration of that, or had they always kind of looked at it from the perspective of, we are going to fight the Japanese, and the Japanese are going to come at us in full strength, regardless of what other nations might be doing?
There's a lot in answering that question well, because through most of the interwar period, the 20s and 30s, the U.S. Navy is assuming this is going to be a blue U.S. on orange Japan war. That's it. It's the two of us. There won't be any alliances. That's how it's going to work. However, as you say, right, war breaks out September 1939 in England or in Europe. England is pulled into it. France is pulled into it. The Dutch are pulled into it. And now the dynamics in the Pacific are shifting, and the U.S. Navy has to, or at least the political leadership above the U.S. Navy acknowledges, wait a minute, this is really complicating issues. You alluded to the Rainbow Plans a few minutes ago, and the Rainbow Plans are a reaction to this, right? So you see, after the outbreak of war in Europe, a shift in U.S. thinking from Orange Plan to Rainbow Plans. How do we fight as part of a global coalition against the Axis powers? And initially, these are very focused. Well, they have different thrusts, but several of them are very focused on defense of the Western Hemisphere. Right? How do we ensure that the United States and its political interests can be protected if Europe is just consumed? And then after the fall of France in 1940, wow, what happens if the English fall too? How is the United States going to survive in a world like that? Now, in the Pacific, there is concern that the Japanese are going to use the European War as an excuse to expand their territory, right? To take over the Dutch East Indies and potentially other places. And so the Rainbow Plans that look at the Pacific begin to think about, well, how could we act aggressively? How could the United States act aggressively against the Japanese in a coalition? So how could we use Dutch or British bases, potentially Singapore, for example, to hold that barrier between, like, say, the Philippines and Australia, the Malay barrier? How can we secure that and prevent the Japanese from advancing farther south? It doesn't change tactics much, but it changes the strategy. It changes how they think about how a war might happen. And so I think that it doesn't shift the Navy's attitude greatly. I mean, it does in the sense that, oh, gee, we might get pulled into this conflict farther to the west than we had anticipated to fight with the Dutch and the British, for example. U.S. fleet commander at the time, Admiral James O. Richardson, is very opposed to this idea, doesn't think it's going to make sense. But it doesn't really shift how the Navy is thinking about tactically fighting. It doesn't really shift how they're thinking about that, which, to an extent, if you look at the ABDA command and how poorly, in a lot of ways, it dealt with the Japanese advance in early 1942, late 1941, you could argue that there's some lost opportunity there. Perhaps the United States should have made more of the ability to fight with these allies tactically more effectively, but it didn't. It didn't really consider that.
Okay. And obviously going into, once the US gets involved in World War II, and is able to actually fight a battle as opposed to being ambushed on a Sunday, you get some, as you say, fairly decisive victories like Midway. You get some strategic but not necessarily tactical victories like Coral Sea. And then you get some complete disasters like most of the sea battles in the early part of the Guadalcanal campaign. What would you say are the main weaknesses in US Navy tactics that influence some of those slightly less than ideal outcomes in 42?
A number of different things. But before I get to them, one of the things that I want to emphasize is the Japanese were very capable. And so I think one of the most important factors here is how good they were as a Navy and as a fighting force. You mentioned the surprise on a Sunday, right? Well, that surprise on the Sunday is, I mean, now we can look back in history. Okay, the Japanese had 6 carriers and they strike Pearl Harbor with it. But in December 1941, that is an unprecedented amount of strength to be concentrated and to use. And then they range far afield with it, right? So that striking force hits not only Pearl Harbor, but it also raids Darwin in northern Australia. It raids Sri Lanka, or modern day Sri Lanka, what was Ceylon, and chases the Royal Navy out of the Indian Ocean. So this is a very potent force that they have. And then because the Japanese have been restricted by treaty, as I alluded to, they're looking for qualitative advantages. So make every platform more powerful, more effective. Naval aviation is a way to get around the restriction of the treaty and develop striking power. And another one is night tactics. And so they invest heavily in this, and they get very good at it. Their plan before the war, if they basically knew what the Orange Plan involved, at least at a high level, right? The U.S. Navy is going to come across the Pacific. So, well, let's surprise it at night and let's attack it with destroyers and other ships. Eventually, these night destroyer attacks are going to be supported by cruisers, and then even beyond cruisers, the Congo class, the old battle cruisers, get rebuilt as fast battleships in the interwar period, and they're going to support these nocturnal attacks. So it's almost a decisive battle. The night before the decisive battle is some of their intention. And they couple that tactical development with the largest and most powerful torpedoes in the world. They develop torpedoes that are oxygen, they burn oxygen rather than just compressed air. So they have an unprecedented range. They can range as far as a battleship shell and very high speeds. And now the U.S. Navy is aware of this. I mean, because they can begin to sense what the Japanese are going to do. I mean, it's logical. And the U.S. Navy tries to get better at defending the fleet at night. It does. It gets more capable, more sophisticated tactics for fighting at night. The night search and attack is a basic model of this kind of concept. So they know, both navies know we're going to have, or we have the potential for night actions. But then the disasters of 42, as you call it, like Savo Island is the most important of these. This is the first night action for the Guadalcanal campaign. It's fought very soon after the invasion. And I think it's a useful vehicle to talk about some of the problems, because what happens is Vice Admiral Makawa Gunichi, who's commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet, he forms a scratch team very quickly, right? Sort of like a pickup group. What ships are available, gathers them. It's mostly cruisers. They come down the slot and then attack Rear Admiral Richmond Turner's amphibious force there, and basically decimate the screen that he has. 4 Allied cruisers are sunk. And the most important factor here is surprise. Surprise is really one of the most important things that happens in these night actions, and Makawa uses it to the fullest. Now, he surprises Turner's forces for one reason, because they're all fatigued. Right, most of these officers have been on alert for several days. They've been subjected to 2 days of aerial attacks. There's been the invasion of Guadalcanal. And so when Makawa attacks, a lot of ship captains are actually asleep. They're trying to recuperate. Command and control isn't terribly effective. Turner's screen commander is Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, the Royal Navy. He's in conference with Turner at the time the attack happens. So he's not there to command. The instructions that he's left behind, I think, are suitable for a Royal Navy formation, but they lack the kind of detail that U.S. Ship captains are expecting. Usually that kind of detail would have been presented in a conference, so they would have talked about how to fight together. They would have developed a sense. The captains don't have it, and so they don't come together. They don't respond quickly, and perhaps most importantly, the faith that they've placed in radar, because there are 2 radar picket destroyers outside the Sound, is misplaced, because the radar on those destroyers, and the lookouts on those destroyers too, don't see Makawa and his approaching ships, and that undermined faith in radar and exposes some of its limitations. Now, Savo disrupts the confidence of the South Pacific Naval Commander, Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. It takes him a long time to get back up to want to contest the waters off Guadalcanal. He does in October. Rear Admiral Norman Scott wins victory at the Battle of Cape Esperance, but it isn't really until later in that month, when Halsey relieves Gormley, that the U.S. Navy commits itself to trying to contest the waters off Guadalcanal. 2 more victories in November, although they're extremely costly, both at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The first one is Rear Admiral Callahan's fight, and the second one is Rear Admiral Lee's with the battleships. And all these expose numerous flaws, as you alluded to in your question, right? So one of the first problems is the U.S. Navy officers expect to have a plan, expect to go into battle with a plan. We're going to have some sort of structure, some sort of concept of how we're going to fight. Most of the battles off Guadalcanal, there isn't one, because either there isn't time to develop one, or like with Crutchley, there's other events. And one of the reasons that there isn't time is because plans were expected to be somewhat contextual, right? It's not just like a plan that I'm going to issue to everybody, and then you read it and you make sense of it. We need to come together and talk about the plan, sort of refine it in a conference. That was the concept. And there wasn't time for those things. And that contributes or builds off of the second problem, which is that there isn't a doctrine. Now, I'm choosing that term very carefully, because there is a doctrine. There's a U.S. Navy tactical doctrine exists, but it's high level, and its principles that was expected to be made real through the collaboration of ships and their captains working together, right? So doctrine was expected to be contextual. It was expected to reflect their dispositions, their capabilities, and the attributes of their ships. And you had to have time to work together to do that. Before the war, they did. So when ships that had practiced together had an opportunity to fight together, like the old destroyers of the Asiatic fleet off Balikpapan, this could work. Off Guadalcanal, they don't have that. And part of the reason they don't have that is now there's a war in 2 oceans. There aren't enough ships to go around. And so a lot of the ships that are being put into the battles off Guadalcanal are scratch teams that they haven't worked together before, and they aren't familiar with each other. So there's no doctrine in the sense that they haven't been able to put this together. And you'll see that in documents of the time. They'll complain about how there isn't a doctrine or we don't have a doctrine. Doesn't mean that there wasn't any Navy doctrine, just means that they didn't have a task force doctrine, for example. So the two anchors that the Navy's relying on to figure out how to fight, plans and doctrine, don't exist. And this feeds into a lot of the challenges. Now, that's exacerbated by one other thing, which is there's no organization on board the ships that is dedicated to making sense of what's going on around them. You have all these new information sources, TBS radio, radar, traditional lookouts, of course, and the way to have all that analyzed and synthesized was in each ship captain's or formation commander's brain. And there's too much information, it's moving too fast, and they can't make sense of it. So the need to have some sort of information processing mechanism aboard the ship is identified, and the Combat Information Center is developed as a response to this. Later in November, after those decisive actions that Halsey's forces fight, Nimitz issues instructions to the Pacific Fleet to have every ship develop a Combat Information Center. So this lesson gets learned, and then new information processing mechanisms are experimented with and begin to come to the fore, and that's really important. But as far as the problems, those are a series of them.
Mm-hmm. So I suppose one of the other fairly large problems the US Navy faces is the fact that it's not actually allowed to have full command of the Pacific theater, with it being divided up, with the absolute southwestern Pacific being put under command of General MacArthur. So how did the US Navy react, and how did that affect their sort of way of fighting the war when they're just told, you know what, actually this big chunk of the operational theater is now under the control ultimately of an Army officer and not a Navy man?
This is quite challenging, because, and a lot of it is because MacArthur is quite challenging. He's a difficult individual to work with. There's plenty of evidence of that throughout the war. But it's important, I think, to understand the relationships, right? As you say, the theater is split. So there's the Southwest Pacific under MacArthur, and then there's the Pacific Ocean areas under Nimitz, which is divided into the South Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the North Pacific. MacArthur is just
Yeah.
He has three different subordinate naval commands in the war, commanders, symbolic of his difficulty to work with, right? The first one is Vice Admiral Leary, and then Vice Admiral Arthur Carpenter. Neither of those can work with him. Eventually, he gets someone who is tactful and able to subordinate his own ego enough to collaborate effectively, and that's Admiral Thomas Kincaid, who had commanded carriers and cruisers, and previously to joining MacArthur had been commander in the North Pacific. Halsey works with MacArthur well too, right? Because Halsey becomes the South Pacific naval commander, and then after the victory at Guadalcanal, Halsey is sort of dotted line into MacArthur to coordinate their advances in each of their areas. So Halsey moves up to the Solomons, and MacArthur tries to capture the northern coast of New Guinea so that they can isolate and reduce the base at Rabaul. MacArthur really wanted to recapture it, but that turned out to be a bad idea. So fortunately, it was bypassed. So it's not impossible to get along with MacArthur. But it's difficult, and it's few naval officers seem to be able to do it. And I think part of the challenge is that MacArthur's approach to command is it reflects his personality somewhat, but it also reflects the U.S. Army's dispositions. It's very centralized. He forms a general headquarters. It's a joint command. It's a combined command, but it's joint and combined at the highest levels. That is headquarters level. Admiral Nimitz's approach is fundamentally different. Right, Pacific Ocean areas is also a joint command, but Nimitz is joint all up and down. So you will have isolated island commands like in the South Pacific, like Samoa and places like that. Those are joint commands within Nimitz's domain. Jointness is pervasive. And what Nimitz is doing is trying to decentralize and delegate authority and responsibility because he wants to be able to, his subordinates to be able to react quickly to emerging circumstances. So here you're in charge of Samoa, or you're in charge of this other island group. You control everything on it. We might centralize air assets periodically so that we can use those effectively, but we're going to decentralize Joint Command. MacArthur centralizes it. And I think that was challenging for naval officers. It's a very different concept. I get into the implications of that in a little bit more detail on a forthcoming book that hopefully is going to come out next fall about Admiral Nimitz' approach to command. And then finally, I mean, MacArthur's aggressive, which is good. Navy appreciates that. United States citizenry appreciates that, but he's so focused on the Philippines. We are going to go back to the Philippines, right? This is a personal obligation. He's going to return, and he also thinks it's a national obligation, right, to liberate the Philippine people from Japanese domination. And so, oftentimes, what's presented is the choice to divide the Pacific into these two theater commands that were going to have a dual offensive is a violation of some fundamental principles of strategy, right? You want to concentrate force. You want to go at the enemy along the decisive avenue of advance. But if you look at the way the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other American officers were thinking about this, they felt there were advantages to having both Nimitz and MacArthur run an offensive simultaneously. Admiral King was very clear about this. He thought that this could whipsaw, that's his term, the Japanese, right? Confront them with an offensive on two fronts, force them to have to choose which one to oppose, and then allow the other to advance more rapidly. So there was a deliberate strategy about this, supported both by MacArthur's aggressiveness and Nimitz's determination to move quickly. Sometimes this gets built up into a conflict about, do we go to Luzon or do we go to Formosa? Obviously, Luzon in the Philippines. That's where MacArthur wanted to go. But I think that more often is made out of that than it ought to be, because by the time a decision had to be made, sort of from the midpoint to later on in 1944, it was obvious that Formosa was just too far logistically. An advance to the island wasn't going to be supported. And so when Nimitz and MacArthur and President Roosevelt met in Pearl Harbor, there wasn't a lot of acrimony and generalized agreement. Like, Admiral Leahy was there, and he commented on that, how far, you get away from Washington, you get off, apart from some of the politics. I don't think he used that term, but it was surprising how easily the theater commanders could agree with the general approach. Return to the Philippines, use that to cut off the Japanese from the south, and then make that the springboard for the final advance on Japan.
Fair enough. So obviously the US Navy, immediately before its own involvement, and then in the war itself, they're having reports come in from other navies on how they're fighting various Axis powers. So how much did the US Navy draw on the reports it got from those allied navies in adapting its own tactics?
This is a great question, because I think it needs to be looked into a bit more. There's a historian I know, his name is Corbin Williamson, who has done a lot of good work on this. And he and I were on a panel together earlier this year, and he presented a paper about how the U.S. Navy was learning from observing the Royal Navy and its performance against German aircraft prior to the U.S. entry into the war. So 1939, 1940, particularly the fighting around Norway. And a lot was being learned there. And I think one of the reasons is because much of the capabilities of aircraft were unanticipated, right? They can fly faster than anticipated. They can attack a bit more effectively. And so the Navy realizes this, from the observers that have been sent to participate with the Royal Navy, and decides, well, we've got to make some improvements. And you see the results of some of this making it onto ships before Pearl Harbor. There's the King Board, which is examines or makes recommendations about how to improve the anti-aircraft facilities of U.S. ships. Like, we need to cut down some masts to provide more arcs of fire. We need better splinter protection, etc. And so that's learning. And you also see it with regard to how to handle carriers, aerial operations. There's learning there as well. What we haven't seen much evidence of, I asked Corbin about this, and then I haven't seen it myself, is how that sort of thread happened when it comes to surface warfare tactics and doctrine, right? So there are observers, but it doesn't appear as if there was much influence on how the U.S. Navy was planning to fight with its surface ships. Most of that seems to have been homegrown. And so I think there's a couple different reasons for that. One, I think it's because surface warfare tactics really in World War II get driven by the Pacific Fleet, right? They're fighting the Japanese. The Japanese are a significant challenge, and there's a lot of fighting that happens. There's not so much surface action in Europe, at least that the U.S. Navy is involved in. And also in the Pacific, the Allied ships, Australia, New Zealand ships, other ships, they're integrated in U.S. formations and they're forced to adopt U.S. patterns. So it's more of an imposition of, we will fight our way and you will integrate with us because there's way more of us than there are of you. And I think there's a little bit of a bias here as well, right? We know what we're doing. This is what we've done for years. Airplanes, okay, there are some unknowns there. There's some uncertainty there, so we'll learn as much as we can. But when it comes to figuring out how to get guns on target or how to lay torpedoes, we know how to do that. So there's not as much that we need to learn. One thing that I really like to do is have some sort of a deep dive comparison between like CIC processes and action information organization processes, right? That's the Royal Navy equivalent, the action information organization, because I think there are some important differences there that reflect preconceived notions of the two different navies. But I haven't done that. I haven't had time.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's definitely something that we'll look at in the future. There's probably as you said, there's a fair bit to learn, especially when it comes to how both sides coordinate aircraft, as we mentioned. But I suppose there's the flip side to it, which is obviously they're not getting reports from the Japanese and German and Italian navies, but they are observing what they're doing. In the case of the Italian and German navies, mostly what they're doing to the allies, and in the Japanese case, what they're doing to the US Navy's own ships. So how much does the US Navy draw on those observed Axis tactics when it comes to changing how they operate?
Oh, quite a bit here, right? Because as I mentioned, the Japanese are quite capable, more capable than anticipated, and I think some of that is quite surprising initially. We talked about the fighting off Guadalcanal. Tassafaronga, which is the last major battle fought off the island, is really important in that regard because it introduces a new paradigm. This is where the U.S. Navy has decided we're going to rely on cruiser gunfire at night. We're going to try to keep our cruisers out of enemy torpedo water. And the Japanese have decided, well, we're going to stop risking heavy ships in the Solomons, and instead we're going to rely on light cruisers and destroyers. And so you get American gunfire against Japanese torpedoes. And then this paradigm holds for about the next 8 months. And it favors the Japanese because the U.S. ships and the officers have underestimated what the Japanese torpedoes can do. And they're assuming that if we open fire at about 10,000 yards, which is about as far away as we can spot shell splashes with 6-inch guns, and don't close to any more than about 6,000, then we will be outside of torpedo range. And against U.S. torpedoes, that would have been true. But it's not true against the Japanese torpedoes. It's not true at all. And so the Japanese use the speed and stealth of their destroyers to get within effective torpedo range for their ships, and the American cruisers rely on their gunfire. Almost invariably, they will overwhelm one or two of the Japanese ships, whichever ones present the best radar target, and then they'll hit almost nothing for the rest of the battle. Meanwhile, the torpedoes are devastating the American cruisers. So, at Tassafaronga and then two other battles in July of '43, Kula Gulf and Kulamangara, The Allies have 2 cruisers sunk and then a total of 6 damaged in those battles. And in exchange, they only sink 3 Japanese destroyers and an Allied cruiser. So this approach favors the Japanese, and eventually, the U.S. Navy begins to realize how potent Japanese torpedoes really are, not just in terms of their power, but range. And so by November 1943, they finally recognized this. It took well over a year to understand what they could do. And at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, where Admiral Aaron Merrill keeps his cruisers a lot farther away. It's more difficult to hit with guns at that range, but he does a good job at fending off a Japanese attempt to sort of replicate the Battle of Salvo Island, because Allied forces have just landed at Empress Augusta Bay, and he's protecting the transports there. So that produces a clear U.S. victory. This is a very definite adaptation, right? We will fight at longer range because now we recognize what the Japanese torpedoes can do. But a more important adjustment happens a little bit earlier. So after Kolomangara, the South Pacific forces are not entirely out of cruisers, but very, very much running low on them. And they've got a new amphibious force commander, officer named Admiral Theodore Wilkinson. And he decides, well, I don't have enough cruiser groups to continue to pressure the Japanese, so I'm going to let the destroyers roam up the slot independently. And he had a very talented destroyer commander, a guy named Arleigh Burke, who I mentioned earlier, who had developed new tactics. And Burke, in some sense, marries the best of pre-war concepts with wartime capabilities granted by radar and the Combat Information Center. So he decides he's going to divide into 2 destroyer attack groups, two divisions, and one is going to approach stealthily. Right, we're going to use radar to approach the Japanese. We're going to get within torpedo firing range, and then they're going to fire torpedoes. And meanwhile, the other division is going to hang back. And in case there's any signal that the Japanese have seen the approach of the first division, we'll open fire. Now, Burke gets transferred before he can actually put this into practice, but his captains were familiar enough with the concept that when his replacement came in, Commander Frederick Moosberger, they pull Moosberger aside and they're like, hey, look, we've got a plan. We know what to do. Let us execute this. And he does, to Moosberger's credit, he's like, all right, they know what to do. I haven't been here very long. This Burke guy, he sounds smart. And so at the Battle of Vella Gulf, that's what happens. It's Burke's tactics, Moosberger's in command, and it works. They approach stealthily. They fire their torpedoes. After their torpedoes arrive, they start shooting, and they sink 3 Japanese destroyers without any loss. Now, Burke gets a chance to replicate these tactics later in November, after Empress Augusta Bay at the Battle of Cape St. George, and same thing. And I think the Naval War College called it an almost perfect victory. So these adaptations show how the Navy is responding to Japanese tactics, and then also leveraging the increasing capabilities of things like the Combat Information Center, radars, and more cohesive formations that had the time to train and fight together. And that's what I think that's one of the keys that you see with Moosberger's replacement of Burke, right? There has been enough cohesion in the formation that when Moosberger shows up, they're able to say, we have a plan, let us execute it, and he has confidence in them that they're going to do it. So a big shift from Guadalcanal.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, so we're talking about they're absorbing lessons from various navies. They're developing their own lessons from identifying what doesn't work and what works from the pre-war stuff. So, do you think it's possible to identify a time period or a campaign as kind of the tipping point between when the U.S. Navy is previously using a mix of pre-war tactics and on-the-fly adaptation of what they're observing, over to we've taken all this on board and we now have our own new complete doctrine that's informed by all these previous lessons of war, and we're now going to use this. Is there the kind of point where that happens?
That question is really thought-provoking. And I'm glad you shared it with me beforehand, because that gave me time to sort of think about it and synthesize what I was going to come at it. Um, and I had difficulty with it because sort of this complete everything seems to build on what comes before. So charting a breakpoint is a little challenging, but I think there is a clear breakpoint. I think there is one that really does fit with this. So just let me talk through some of the arc of the war to get to that. 1942, clearly adaptation, evolving pre-war doctrine to fit circumstances, right? And so you see that off Guadalcanal, and they're trying to come up with new patterns and new forms. 1943 is really important because it's the year where some of these lessons begin to take hold and the new concepts begin to find their way into the fleet, right? So the Combat Information Center, mentioned that one already. That's a core aspect of that. And potentially even more important is the new doctrinal manual that gets introduced in June of 1943, which is called PAC-10, Current Tactical Orders and Doctrine for the Pacific Fleet. And it's intended to solve the problem that's been seen off Guadalcanal, right? We're exchanging ships and formations too fast. We don't have the kind of cohesion that we need to be able to do doctrinal development the way we did before the war. So it shifts doctrinal development up a level. Instead of being at the sort of the squadron level, at the lower level, now we're going to do it at a higher level at the fleet, and we're going to take some patterns that we had used, some battle plans that we've used for major fleet action, and we're going to extend them for smaller tactics, minor action. That's key. But what PAC-10 also does is it supports the shift from the pre-war idea of a battleship-centric fleet to one that is based around carrier task forces. And what's different about that is with carrier task forces, you want to be able to disperse, to sort of overwhelm a large area, a number of different air bases at once, particularly when you think about the islands in the Central Pacific, right? The Japanese have air bases among many of these. And you want to isolate a substantial portion of each one of those island groups to support an amphibious assault. But at the same time, you want to have the ability to concentrate and come together if the Japanese come out and you want to seek a battle action. So PAC-10 supports both of these things. It makes ships more interchangeable, and it supports the shift to carrier task forces. So that's the beginning of this breakpoint, but it's not the point, or at least I wouldn't call it the point. Because the fleet's got to adapt to this. It's got to test this. It's got to figure out how this works. And later on in 1943, there's a series of raids that begin to test this concept. So Marcus Island gets attacked in September. This is the fleet figuring out how to work with PAC-10, figuring out how to work with carrier task forces. The Gilbert Islands get attacked later on in September. And then there's a big strike on Wake Island in October. And that begins to prove the theory. And then the break, I think, comes with the initiation of the Central Pacific Offensive in November 1943, with Operation Galvanic that seizes Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands. And then the very quick follow-on, which is Operation Flintlock, that invades the Marshalls at the end of January. And that, I think, is the transition. So now we are not a battle fleet anymore. We are carrier-centric task forces, and we have PAC-10 to guide the development of our plans and doctrine, and prevent us from having to sort of share minds so much when we come together or when we exchange ships and forces. And that's an important break, and that's also extremely successful, right? Because Flintlock upends Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific and shakes up their governmental structure, their high command. Because they realize, oh, gee, right, the fleet base at Truk now is no longer secure. We have to figure out what the next line of defenses are, and the Imperial Japanese Navy is blamed for some of that defeat. And then on the U.S. side, PAC-10 becomes the basis for a new fleet-wide manual, so U.S. fleet, USF-10A, and the A distinguishes it from the old USF-10s, which were issued before the war, which didn't have anywhere near as much detail or structure.
Fair enough. Okay, so obviously now they're operating under a brand new, shiny new doctrine. But what would you say obviously every doctrine has strengths and weaknesses. What would you say the main strengths and indeed possible weaknesses of this new doctrine are, as sort of when they're facing off against the Japanese?
Well, I alluded to some of the strengths already. It makes the fleet more adaptable and dynamic. It's easier to reconfigure. So it's easier to integrate new ships in or take ships out, to change task force structures to accomplish certain objectives. So it's very good at that. It facilitates this rapid movement of the Central Pacific Offensive, which, when you look at it, is kind of remarkable speed, right? Because it goes from the Gilberts in November 1943 to Leyte Gulf in October 1944. So through the Central Pacific in less than a year. So that is a great advantage. It cuts down on the work that a lot of naval officers have to do. If you look at plans and orders through World War II, it's very interesting, the shift that happens, right? Because previously, prior to Pac-10, task force and formation commanders will issue instructions for battle plans, and you get a sense of what they're thinking and how they're planning to use their forces, and you can read them, and they're right there. After Pac-10 gets issued, so by early 1944, what they're just saying is, we'll use plans from Pac-10 or we'll use plans from EOSEP 10A, and that's it. It's just one line, one sentence. That's what we're going to do. So it's faster to put these plans and orders together. They begin to become more templated. But a weakness is that it disrupts the pattern that the Navy had used to innovate and learn when it comes to tactics, or makes it different. Because prior to the war and through 1942, the U.S. Navy's relying on variability and deliberately trying to capitalize on it, right? So developing doctrine at low levels is a choice. It's a conscious choice to allow experimentation and allow different officers to try to formulate the best ways to fight the forces that they have. And that means the doctrine can be contextually sensitive. And it also means that it's going to reflect the capabilities of different forces and leverage the creativity of different people, like Burke, right? So one of the reasons Burke is able to come up with what he comes up with is because he's empowered to do that, and he's a creative, analytical mind. So through the interwar period and early World War II, there's this, they foment innovation through tactical doctrine by cultivating this variability, and then at the same time having mechanisms like the fleet exercises or other problems, and then wartime experience to try to identify the most effective techniques. So they're balancing exploration of new concepts and new ideas with the exploitation of the most effective. And the balance of exploration and exploitation is a characteristic of a learning organization. Pac-10's weakness is that by imposing a greater level of standardization, it disrupts that process. It makes it more difficult. So it's harder to explore and experiment. It's not promoted the same way it was. I think it's an understandable and logical trade-off, right? You want to win the war. You want to lose as few people as you can, accomplishing that end. But I think that is the negative that comes along with it.
Fair enough. And I suppose that leads, it's kind of, this is the doctrine that leads the US into the last stages of the war. How well does the US then adapt to the new technological environment that it's facing at the end of the war with all these new late war threats? So you've got jets, guided weapons, all this new stuff that was in absolutely no way, shape or form foreseeable, or indeed even in use during the first stages of the war.
I think that learning ability is continuing. It's tempered though, and it's harnessed in different directions. A useful vehicle for this is the Japanese decision to adopt kamikaze tactics, suicide planes, and boats and torpedoes and other things, because they're almost like an early guided missile, in a way. And I wrote an article that was published in the Naval Institute's Naval History magazine last year in their October issue about the kamikaze and the learning mechanisms that the Navy was employing. And one thing that I want to stress is that generally we think, or at least a lot of the English-speaking histories, we tend to sort of categorize kamikaze tactics as something that's, desperate or keyed to a warrior ethos that the Japanese had. And I think it's more important to think about this as a rational decision based on some of the challenges that they were confronted with. So if you look at U.S. Carrier air defense systems, they have evolved from 1942 to be very good at detecting and intercepting large incoming strikes. Right, this happens at Philippine Sea. That's sort of the quintessential demonstration of how this could work. And the Japanese get nowhere near any of the carriers. I think they get close to some of the battleships, but they don't really do any serious damage. And they understand this, and they begin to appreciate the weaknesses of that system. It's got strengths, but it's also got weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses is it can't handle distributed strikes that are coming in from multiple directions with individual or small numbers of planes. And so they begin to attack this way. Now, you've got to offset the fact that now you don't have a massed strike, so you're probably not going to get as many hits. And so to secure comparable amounts of damage, they decide, well, we can use the whole plane. The plane becomes, a weapon. And so kamikaze tactics have a certain logic to them. And they use these approaches to disrupt U.S. air defense systems if they can come from multiple directions, particularly at low level or high level. They can overwhelm combat information centers, and the ability to process incoming strikes by just having a whole lot of incoming targets that are frequently changing direction and more unpredictable in their movements. So you can see how the Navy approaches this problem and how it leverages a learning system with some of the things that some of the decisions that it made to try to counter it. Right, and one approach is, well, let's destroy the Japanese planes on the ground. Like if they're harder to shoot down and locate, let's get them before they can take off. So in the fighting in the Philippines, Admiral Halsey and then his carrier commander, Vice Admiral John McCain, try something they called the Big Blue Blanket, which is basically to cover Luzon and its airfields with American fighter planes. And this works pretty well before the invasion of Mindoro. It doesn't work quite as well before the invasion of Luzon, but this is one tactic. It's made possible by increasing the number of fighters on the U.S. carriers. So the fighter complements increase, bomber complements go down. Natural reaction to this. Another idea is to change tactics for interception. The Japanese had developed a sense of like how far out you could reasonably intercept from the fighter directors aboard the carriers. So they would break up their formations outside of that range. While the fast carrier task forces have enough destroyer escorts that they can position a picket line of destroyers beyond that range, interposed between the carriers and the Japanese bases. And so now this becomes the fighter director group. It's a group of destroyers. They can offer some protection to each other. They have radars and they have fighter directors aboard, so they can help intercept incoming enemy strikes and also peel off any followers that are following American carrier planes back to the carriers. Now, the amphibious groups don't have this capability, they don't have the mobility, so they can't position a picket line between them and the Japanese bases. They also don't have enough destroyers. So you get the picket ring around Okinawa, which doesn't work quite as well because initially it's populated by single destroyers and then later on paired. But the Japanese do a lot of work during their large kamikaze attacks to destroy some of the picket ships. They're set upon quite frequently. So it doesn't work quite as well. Better weaponry is another evolutionary approach, like the proximity fuse has been introduced. And so the 5-inch guns firing proximity fuses are one of the most effective weapons to shooting down kamikazes because you have to destroy the plane. You can't just damage it. And the 40 millimeters are pretty good at damaging. They can occasionally knock down the planes, but you have to actually hit the plane. Unlike with the 5-inch gun, with the proximity fuse, you just need to get close. So one of the things that the Navy begins to invest in is, well, we should be replacing quad 40 millimeter mounts with twin 3-inch guns. And you see those proliferate after the war. Like most of the 40 millimeters get replaced with 3-inch gun mounts. One of the reasons is you can fire the 3-inch in the semi-automatic way. Uh, and because it can be fitted with the proximity fuse, it's much more effective at shooting down these kinds of targets. Potentially a cruise missile, as long as it's not going too fast, as well. And then there's efforts to better detect incoming Japanese planes. So there's an early, what we would today call like an early AWACS idea. It's a B-17 equipped with a radar. It's going to fly above the fleet and have fighter directors inside it. So now you've got fighter directors aloft. I think most people probably don't realize that this concept is so old. I mean, now it's a natural thing, right? We want to have some kind of a plane like that can do that sort of direction from above. But they were thinking of that in 1945. An alternative that the Navy considered was a TBM, an Avenger, equipped with radar that would be radio linked to the carrier. So now you would have the carrier fighter directors linked to a radar that was aloft. And two advantages to this: you could detect low-flying Japanese planes at greater ranges, because the radars aboard the ships could only search so far before they got into the horizon. And it would solve the problem of Japanese planes that could get right overhead, which is sort of in a radar hole. There were other efforts to tilt radars to close that hole, but those didn't prove very effective. The aerials did not rotate well, and I'm not aware of any effort that came to fruition with that. I mean, they tried it, but it was an experiment that failed. So you see a variety of these attempts to come up with new ideas, and there's the task force dedicated to this sort of thing that Admiral Lee was put in charge of before the end of the war. He was the battleship commander in the Pacific, but he was brought back to try to investigate different new innovative approaches to solving the kamikaze threat. The war ended before much of it was able to be implemented. But you see these kinds of efforts. The thing that I think is interesting is, that is a more systemic approach, right? It's at a higher level. It's not, I mean, they were trying different things within the fleet. There was some experimentation allowed, but now it's, as we get to the end of the war, it's more of a dedicated, focused experimentation approach rather than let's do it more organically within the fleet, which I think charts some of the difference, some of the change that the Navy had gone through over the course of the war.
Fair enough. Well, that brings us to the ends of our list of questions, and brings us roughly to approximately the end of World War II for the US Navy. So thank you very, very much to Trent Hone, our special guest, and hopefully everyone out there, like myself, is much more clued up on how the US Navy actually developed its tactics and its capabilities through the war, and ended the war as a very, very different Navy to the one that began the war. So if you'd like to learn more, as per the previous video, check out the book Learning War, link in the description below. It's definitely worth a good read, and obviously keep an eye out for the next book, all about Admiral Nimitz, coming up, as you said, hopefully fall 2022.
Hopefully, yeah. I don't want to commit the publisher to anything, but that's what I hope.
Fair enough. Well, on that hopeful note, we shall wrap it up here, and see you all again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.